All of us know the comment made by the previous Rebbe during the 1930s when he reminisced about his days in the Shpalerka prison in 1927 in Peizayin. That he commented, the Friedrich Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, said, if someone would give me all the money in the world to go through the experience I went through then, I wouldn't take it. But at the same time, he said, if someone would give me all the money in the world to forfeit the experience that I had, I wouldn't take that either. In other words, he was saying it was a terrible experience, but it was very, very meaningful, very rewarding, and he wouldn't give up having had the experience for anything in the world. This thought can be qualified by another thought the previous Rebbe said during the years that he was living under the Soviets in Russia, where he said, Yidden, chap darein mesiras nefesh, Jewish people, gather in, collect the mesiras nefesh that you can gather, sit amol kommen de Zeit, wenn man wird es nicht haben, und man wird sich nach der Ruf benken. There will be a time that mesiras nefesh, self-sacrifice, great extreme giving of self at great personal cost will no longer be a possibility, and we'll miss it, we'll long for it. And I must tell you, I remember being at a Bacha in Yeshiva, and being at a Fabringen with Reb Mendel Futterfass, and him saying very plainly, I miss it. I miss the years of Mesiras Nefesh. Reb Mendel went through a very difficult time in Russia. Very, very scary time, very frightful time. He was separated from his family for more than a decade. He missed his children's weddings. And he said, I miss it. I miss the Mesiras Nefesh. There is a book that was recently published, and I've mentioned it in several classes in the recent past because I'm really, really excited about this book. I feel that this book will do more for strengthening Yerushalayim Chassidus amongst our young people, our boys and girls, than all the fancy books about the great Chassidim of yesteryear, like Reb Nissen and Reb Chaim, Shlomo Chaim, and so on, which are wonderful svarim, don't misunderstand. But this is a book about an ordinary man who did extraordinary things. It's called Samarkand. It's written by Reb Hillel Zalman, soll gesund sein, and it's really, really special. And it's really an autobiography. It's officially about the city of Samarkand, but it's his version, it's his account, it's his life, it's his experience, it's his anecdotes. And it describes how they lived in the Soviet Union in the 50s and the 60s until they were miraculously and really quite surprisingly allowed to leave the country. When you read this book, the impression that you're left with is that as long as Stalin was alive, living in Russia and being Jewish was playing with your mortality. You were literally playing with your life. You didn't know if you'd be alive the next day. Once Stalin died, which is 1953, it's a long time ago, they basically stopped killing people. Not entirely, but they basically stopped. In fact, not only did they stop killing people, they didn't really arrest people. They didn't put people away for religious practice. But they intimidated you. And they made you live in fear, perpetual fear, constant fear, chronic fear. And if they ever felt that your fear was dissipating, they would create a display, a situation that would absolutely throw you back into the 50s. You'd think you were about to go to jail forever, and they just would intimidate you into staying suppressed in this condition of fear. He repeats in his book on a number of occasions that in hindsight, he wonders why they did so little. I mean, they raised 1,500 children. 1,500 children in Samarkand got a Jewish education in an effect yeshiva system under the ground. And they had a real yeshiva for Elton. They did so many incredible things. And yet, the fear was so inhibiting. They did so little, relatively speaking, because they were afraid, like the pasuk says of Keila and Edith, they were afraid of nothing. They didn't put him in jail. They certainly didn't shoot him, but they made him think they would. And perhaps their biggest enemy for all those years, from 53 till 71 when they left, Was this fear real or imagined? And he, like I said, you'll have to read the book. There are a number of occasions when the KGB just put the fear of God into them. They just made it so scary, so frightful that for months and years after, they felt frozen into inaction or to limited action and so forth. And I think that was the predominant influence in their lives. Now, a person who lives his whole life in fear doesn't live. You can't live in fear. I am an American-born person. I never knew fear. And my father, Zogazunzain, was born in Moscow. He left Moscow at 8. And he tells me how, as a little child, from the very early stage, as soon as you learn to speak, you learn to be afraid and not to trust. And you can't live that way. You're literally a shadow. You're a ghost. You're not living. And of course, in children, everything is multiplied. It's enlarged. But even in adults, the fear defined them. And it defined every action that they took and every decision that they made and all the thought processes they went through and so forth and so on. But I read a certain episode in this book, and it moved me so much that I actually approached Rabbi Zalman in Shul, and I asked him about it. He describes life in Samarkand, and there's a lot of facets to it. It's complicated, but one of the things that he describes is that young people never went to Shul. Young people, I don't mean children. Young people, I mean people that were working. The retirees went to Shul. If you were over 60 or 70, nobody bothered you. But if you were a young man and went to Shul, you'd have visits, at work, at home, and so on. They never went to Shul. So they made makeshift Shul to daven in people's homes. They would come to Shul after the Shul was officially closed, all kinds of shtick. And there was never really, from what I understand, very large groups. You didn't have 200 people getting together to daven. There was no such concept. It was a minyan, 10, 12, 15. And it was all done in secret and so on. And perhaps there was more than one, and no one knew about anybody else. It was, like they said in Russia, any information you didn't need, you really didn't want. And he belonged to a chevre, about 10 or 15 men. He mentions many of them by name in his book repeatedly. They had the good fortune of sharing their minyan with the great Chassid Rabbi Chanin, Olav Shalom, and for a short while also Rabbi Mendel Futafas passed through Samarkand on his way out of Russia. And he describes Yamim Neroim. His one chapter, it's a short little chapter, but it's so moving. What happened during Aseres Yemei Tshuva? You must understand that all of these people never learned in a yeshiva. Rabbi Zalman never learned in a yeshiva. He got educated at home. And all of his contemporaries, the Mishalavim who appear prominently in this book, and the Zaltzmans and the others, they were all Jews of Mesiras Nefesh. Some of them learned in Samarkand during the war years as children. But they didn't go to yeshiva, they didn't go more in Tosfos. They were all self-made. And he describes them sitting in this room, 15 men, Rosh Hashanah, and everybody's crying. And they weren't crying about Russia. They were doing tshuva. And the sincerity, the earnestness, the tmimus was just incredible. He says, nobody rushed. Everybody took their time. And if you finished davening before somebody else, you opened up a Tillim, you said Tillim, and you waited. They would wait for everybody. For Tkiyas, they could sometimes wait for hours. For the Ber Kechein, for example. And the whole spirit in that room is, we're here to daven, we're here all day long, and there's nothing else to do. He mentions really the hero of the Sefer, the person that comes out, the tzaddik of Samarkand is Reb Moshe, the Geller, Reb Moshe Nisalevich, who was Reb Hillel's mentor, Mashpia, how he would come to the Rosh Hashanah service, in other words, whoever's home they were davening with food. He didn't go home, 48 hours in shul. Who's going home to eat? In other words, the madrege of seriousness about the days was, let's just say, quite a bit higher than ours. And then he describes the first Rosh Hashanah after he left Russia. He was in Israel. And he was living in Kiryat Malachi, in Nachlas Har Chabad. And he was in Shul. And he cried. He cried just like he cried for Russia. But he writes, I didn't cry because I was in the spirit of tshuva. I cried because I was longing already then for Samarkand. He was out of Russia a few months. And he saw that the world that he'd lived in, with all the fear, but was so pristine, so holy, it was gone. And I read this, and it really broke my heart, because what he describes is so genuine, so wonderful, so beautiful. And to you and I, that's a dream. Where does that happen? Where do you see a whole community of Jews, albeit a small one, not rushing? The Chazan can take his time, the Minyan can take their time, they're going to wait for you to daven. I mean, where does that happen? And the idea that his first Rosh Hashanah out of Russia, he cried not in tshuva, but he cried in nostalgia, And then now he's got the same Rosh Hashanah you and I. He's got to go home and eat whatever it is, tzimiz. So I asked him about it. And I said, I read this and it was really moving to me. It's a few pages. It's a very small chapter. And I said, why isn't it that in the West, you don't see people davening this way? There's just really no good excuse. And he said to me, no, you're wrong. You don't understand. He says, I was on this side of the fence and I was on this side of the fence. And in effect, he said, trust me, the tests here are no less difficult than the tests were there. In other words, he understood. He understands why Jews who live in a country where they can daven all day and all night, no one's going to say boo, have a hard time being patient and rushing a chazan and not wanting to wait for the guy who schleps because he has to say each word 4 times in Shmoneh Esrei, that kind of thing. He says, we lived in that world. And it was a world of fear above all else. And it was a world of survival. Under those conditions, this was easy. This was their freedom. This was their escape from that world. You come to the West and you have so many opportunities and so much temptation. And he wasn't trying to say that it's okay not to daven the way they daven in Russia. He says, but the Mesiras Nefesh that you guys know out here in the West is no small than the Mesiras Nefesh we had in Russia. This is what he told me. And I hope I'm repeating the spirit of his words as well as the actual thoughts. But you can ask him. You can see him in Empire Steve and ask him yourself. But this is more or less what he told me. Now, I am bringing this out to make a point. And the point I'm trying to make is that there is something to be said for extremes. When I say there's something to be said for extremes, I don't mean necessarily that extremes are a good thing or a bad thing. I mean they're a thing. Extremes is a phenomena. Extremes is a circumstance. Extremes is a condition of living. And in extreme conditions, extreme things occur. Extreme evil occurs and extreme good occurs. Extreme piety occurs. Extreme corruption occurs. Everything is extreme. In a world that's less extreme, you're far less likely to encounter extreme. Because to generate extreme, to create a power and a passion that's extreme, you need circumstances to support it. And whether they're good or bad, but circumstances support it. And if you don't have those extremes, the circumstances that support extremes, like the fear they lived, you just don't have the ability to muster it, to bring it forward. And nobody is going to deny that this is the world in which we live. We live, Baruch Hashem, Jews all over the world at this point live, relatively speaking, without fear. And it takes away that edge that drives some of us altogether away from Yiddishkeit or underground, and others of us to be martyrs for Yiddishkeit, and creates instead a lukewarm, a part of a balanced kind of a condition that is better than the negative extreme and worse than the positive extreme. It's just our lives, it's our reality. And we have to live the challenges of our world. We can't live the challenges of the world we don't live in. And in the words of the Rebbe, to fuse, to find the will to harness extreme energy and bring it into the normalcy and the balance of our daily lives as we lived here in, relatively speaking, safety and wealth in the West. No human being in his right mind looks for trouble. Nobody wants to find tzaddis to overcome. Nobody looks for suffering, personal or familial or financial, to overcome. That's a fool. That's a masochist. We all would like things to be good. And in fact, we pray to God Almighty on a daily basis. God, please don't test me. Don't test me. Let my life be simple and easy. The Gemara, of course, tells us about David HaMelech, one of the greatest we ever had, who told God Almighty, B'chaneini novanaseni, test me. You tested Avraham Avinu 10 times. Umatzasa es levave neman lefanecha. And as a reward for those tests, Avraham Avinu is considered Avraham Oyevi, God's lover, the perfect Jew, in terms of loyalty to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nobody ever before or after matches Avraham Avinu. David HaMelech asks to be tested, and he fails. Avraham was tested 10 times, David HaMelech was tested once, and David HaMelech failed. Now the Gemara does say that David said that David HaMelech's failure had to do with to create the tshuva method, the new level of tshuva that David did in correcting and returning from and repenting from the sin he had done. Nonetheless, he tested, and he was tested, and he failed. But at the same time, when the test is dumped on us, when we're given a test, when God Almighty challenges a person by no choice of his own, we have to deal with the test. And under those conditions, the polar power, the extreme energies within a person, both good and otherwise, emerge. And if we choose wisely, we can shine. We can do extreme things in the measure, in the side, in the area of good. And that's, in effect, what the previous Rebbe said when he said, for all the money in the world, I wouldn't go through it again, but for all the money in the world, I wouldn't sacrifice what I had. He had the extreme of extreme experiences, and he doesn't want it again. But he wouldn't want to forfeit those memories and the inspiration and the clarity that it gave him. Now, if you have your PDF open in front of you, you're probably wondering what all that I just said has to do with our Maamar Vayishlach. Well, in a word, our Maamar, at least the part of the Maamar we're going to read, and for the record, we're beginning on line 53. I'll tell you why soon. Yaakov Avinu looked for extremes. He sorted out. He did what you're not supposed to do. We understand as a philosophy, you don't look for tests. When the tests find you, you deal with them. Yaakov Avinu looked for an extreme energy. He sought it out. In a world of balance, he insisted on finding an extreme energy, which I'll attempt to explain to you soon. But let me first give you context. 3 years ago, I gave you a shiur on Vayishlach, the beginning of Vayishlach Torah Or. These Maamarim, as I probably told you then, I listened to parts of that class, but I can't say I listened to every minute of it, are very, very unusual. Because this is the only place in Chassidus and Torah Or where the Alter Rebbe explains a series of psukim in a parsha so sequentially, so consistently, so orderly. It's as if it's a running commentary on the story. In other words, Chassidus usually has a pshat on an individual pasuk. Here we have a Chassidus that's a pshat on a story that goes till Chamishi of the parsha and explaining every pasuk, explaining how the story has a mystical flow from start to finish, and every step is another part of the same episode. And it's most unusual in that it's almost like a Chassidic narrative of the biblical account of Yaakov Avinu meeting Esau after his return from Lavan. And I will insert here, as I did 3 years ago, a reference to my website, inside Chassidus.org, where you can, if you look up Parshas Vayishlach, my website goes in, we have a calendar, winter, spring, summer, fall. You'll open up winter, you'll find Vayishlach, find Parsha classes. I gave a class once where I studied the Shalah and the Torah Or, because the Shalah, like the Alter Rebbe, provides a commentary that's a narrative of the whole story. The Shalah is a very creative way of approaching this story in Parshas Vayishlach, and I did both together, the Shalah with this Maamar that we're going to be doing tonight, in one sitting. And if you like to listen, I think you would find that meaningful, useful. But I gave a class 3 years ago in the beginning, and we ran out of time. And in those days, we had an unwritten rule that said you don't give a second class on a topic. We have since evolved or devolved, depending on your point of view. And I figured that it would be nice if we continued what we started then. I gave you a class in the first 52 lines of the Maamar that if you look at your text, you'll see is actually two little Maamars. The first one is from line 1 until line 24. The second one is from line 24 until line 52. And we left it at that, and after some consultation with the experts, we decided that it would be ideal, it would be wise that we continue that discussion. Now, I need therefore to briefly summarize that class. Now, I'm sure that there will be a point in time where people are going to be watching the class I gave 3 years ago and then immediately watching this class and feel like there's some repetition. I cannot help that. I'm not going to give you a 20-minute repeat, but I need to give you a repetition because many of you are going to be listening to this class as a self-standing class, not in conjunction with that. So I'll try to bear in mind that on the one hand, I'm teaching a new class. On the other hand, I really want this to be considered lesson 2 on this particular Maamar. The Alter Rebbe establishes a criteria. Yaakov and Esau represent Tayu and Tikkun. Tayu and Tikkun are defined by polarity and balance. Esau represents extremes, polar extremes, which means that when he's good, he's better than Yaakov, and when he's bad, he's bad. The whole idea of Yaakov is balance, no extremes. And Chassidus argues that in the maintaining of balance, there is a bittul, there is a depth, which is even deeper than the highest and most extreme expression of the polarity of Esau. But Esau in his source is much higher than Yaakov in his source. And Esau in his physical manifestation is the representation of evil, while Yaakov is Kedusha even in this world. So it's a story. Yaakov Avinu has dedicated his life to achieving something. And part of his purpose is to elevate his brother and his polar tendencies. As we learned in Parshas told us in last week's Parsha that Yitzchak was hoping to bless Esau directly so that he would elevate Esau. But as the Maamar Chassidus apt to say, often say, and this is very unusual to find in Chassidus, but in this case it's said repeatedly, Yitzchak was wrong. His idea that he could elevate Esau, that he could harness Esau's polar energies, extreme energies, and bring them into Kedusha by himself was an error. It needs to be done through Yaakov Ishtam Yosef, the balance of his son and Esau's brother, Yaakov Avinu. So the story begins, Yaakov is returning from Lavan. He spent 20 years there. During those 20 years, Yaakov went through incredible challenge and hardship and so forth. But he accomplished a lot, not just physically, but spiritually. Lavan was the greatest thief ever. He's called Arami, and Yaakov out, as they say the expression, he out-gypsied the gypsy. There's another expression which I'm not going to use because it's not appropriate, but he out-cheated the cheater, and he ended up with Lavan's wealth. And of course, the mystical parallel for this is that he was Mavada de Birudim. He corrected whatever inexactitudes he possessed, and he raised himself up left to the level of Atzilus. On his return, the pasuk begins, Vayishlach Yaakov Malachim. He sends representation to his brother. What they tell him is, I went into Galus for 20 years, I struggled at a very difficult time, but I corrected myself. As it says in the next pasuk, Im Lavan Garti, I lived as a foreigner with Lavan. And then and I brought back with me all kinds of livestock, sheep and goats and donkeys and so on, and servants. And he's indicating to Esau that all of this means that he's completed tikkun. He's elevated all the sparks of Kedusha that were lost in his realm. And he says, and now I'm ready to meet you. And the mystical version of this is, Yaakov is saying to Esau, I have corrected and perfected the Kedusha of balance. Now I want to engage with the Kedusha of polarity, of extremes, and use it for Kedusha so that it shouldn't fall, because when the extreme holiness falls, it falls into extreme unholiness. And that's the meaning of the subsequent word, I'm sending representation to you to see if I can find favor in your eyes, that you should join me, and that I should be able to continue my efforts at correcting the world, in addition to having corrected myself, to correct you as well. And of course, that's not how it works out. The angels go and they come back. They go to see his brother Esau, and they find that Esau is nowhere near ready to be corrected. In fact, he's got 400 men, and there's a mysticism about the 400 men. They represent the 400 silver coins that Avraham Avinu gave Ephraim for the Maaseh Machpelah, and there's a whole mysticism, the Oivin al-Seicher, that they represent a klipa which is even higher than Makiv. In short, Yaakov learns that Esau is not giving up without a fight, that Esau has no intention of allowing himself to be elevated and transformed through his brother Yaakov. He's not ready. He's still klipa. Yaakov may have corrected and perfected himself. He may have brought himself into a favorable position, but Esau is not ready. So after Yaakov discovers this, the story continues. Now, of course, on the surface of it, the way the story continues is that Yaakov is afraid for his life. But the mystical version of the story, the Chassidishe of what follows, is that Yaakov says to himself, if Esau is not ready to come to me on his own, I have to lure him in. I have to draw him in like you bait a fish. And what follows is a series of acts that Yaakov does, again, mystically speaking, in addition to the Pshutei Shel Mikra, to get Esau to come into his sphere, into his zone, into his parameter, so he can pull him in, you see. This is the plan. But in doing this, Yaakov Avinu has to take a trick out of Esau's playbook. That means Yaakov represents order, balance, depth, bittul. Esau represents polarity, extreme, passion, intensity, energy. Yaakov has perfected and refined the balance as it exists within himself on the level of Atzilus. He now wants to draw the extreme energies of Esau into that balance and not have it destroy the balance, nor have the polarity and the extremism be quieted or muffled or softened by the balance, but to bring harmony between these two extremes. But Esau is nowhere ready and nowhere willing. So the events that follow are described by Yaakov Avinu as taking steps to draw Esau to him by taking extremes himself. In other words, and as I told you in my introduction, in this Maimer, Yaakov does the unthinkable. He looks for extremes. He's looking for trouble. He's not simply saying, I'm living a life of balance. I've had my share of tzaddas. My tzaddas are behind me. Lavan's gone. Shechem's gone. I'm free. He looks to find within himself an energy of extreme. And he's doing this in the hope of luring the extreme of Esau into his sphere so that he can elevate Esau as well. And I believe that at this point, the correct thing to do is to begin to read, beginning on line 53, which is page 4, if you've printed it out from our website, which is the third of these 4 mini maimers that represent the Torah Or, the beginning of Parshas Vayishlach, which are really not 4 maimers. They're just a shmooze through the Parsha that's identified by Keplach, by Kesaris of the various psukim as we go through it. And we read, Vayomer, Jacob says, and he speaks, Yaakov, Elokei Avi Avraham V'Gemer, the God of my father Abraham and the God of my father Isaac, and so forth, should assist me, should help me out. Pirush, what this means is, She'espal, he prayed, Sheyum Shachelav, that he should be able to draw towards himself, Hamakifim de Gedusha Shala Avis. And forgive me, or don't forgive me, but that's not going to make a difference, I'm doing it anyway. I'm going to translate the word makif not as I normally do. We're going to translate the word makif as polarity, as extreme. He wants to bring to himself extreme energies of holiness, shala avis of the avis. Now understand that in Yaakov's personality, he's just spent 20 years getting rid of those extremes and celebrating balance. And now when he encounters Esau, he deliberately goes back to those extremes and incorporates those extremes into himself. Lazarle, to assist him, he should be able to draw towards him. He should be able to bait the transcendent energies of Torah, which are present in the extremes, both good and evil of his brother. She is Gala Lamata, should be revealed down here into Tikkun. And as a result, he'll be able to elevate and transform Esau. And then the pasuk says, "Vaydez," and through this Gamkein, it will also affect that Hatzileini no miyad Esau v'Gemer shalamata. That in addition to mystically, the spiritual Yaakov Avinu, harnessing and focusing the extreme Esau Harasha, there's also the physical version of the story. Esau wants to kill Yaakov Avinu, and Yaakov Avinu prays that Hashem should give him the wisdom of speaking appropriately to Esau, that he should spare him, that he should forgive him. So Yaakov davens to his ancestors, to the Eibishter, the God of his ancestors, and he prays that the Eibishter give him the clarity to do what he needs to be done. And what needs to be done is to fight polarity with polarity, extreme with extreme. And the point of fighting extreme with extreme is to draw the extreme into the balance, ultimately able to elevate it. And we read on line 56, he divides his camp into two parts. And the Rebbe's observation is, why two? Why not three or four? 3 is the number of Kedusha, 4 is the number of Kedusha, 2 is the number of division. And yet Yaakov chooses to divide his family and his livestock and his wealth into 2 parts as opposed to 3. Says the Rebbe, dividing up the estate into 2 rather than into 3 represents seeking extremes. The very thing that we discussed in the introduction to the Maamar, that you don't want to look for unless it comes to you. Yaakov Avinu sought out. He looked for extremism as a means of luring Esau into him. Says the Rebbe, however, I need to preface. And the Rebbe gives us the classic Tayo Tikkun exchange. Yaakov is all about balance, with the Tiferes plays a vital role. Elamatayu is all about polarity, with only 2 kavim, Yamin and Shmel, right and left, and there is no balance. The primary distinction between the balanced world of Tikkun and the polar world of Tayu is in the world of Tayu, in the polar world, each sphere was distinct and separate from all the others. There was no collaboration and cooperation. While the world of Tikkun is Bitsir Kavim, it has the image of individual poles. However, the Hainu Beis Kavim, 2 extremes of Yamin, Usmail, Ve'emtza, right and the left, but also a center. In other words, that is not 2 but 3. And Shahakav Ha'emtzoi, the middle pole, who that binds and unifies Gamkein, Beis Kavim, the Yamin, Usmail, the 2 poles of right and left, Leyes Miskalim Yachad, there should be an integration. And what this means, in other words, is when you have extreme kindness and extreme severity or exactitude, they never meet. But the kav, inside the middle pole, forces them to meet. It brings them together so that the kindness has a balance of gevura and that the gevura has a balance of chesed. And this is the trademark of Kedusha. The trademark of Kedusha is bittul, but a bittul that doesn't show itself in extremism and jumping off buildings, doing radical things. That you do when God sends a circumstance, but normally, ideally. Bittul means normal life, settled life. But into this normal, settled life, you have integration. Every part of yourself, the most loving part of yourself and the most severe part of yourself, are integrated into one. And what integrates them is Tiferes, the middle pole that creates beauty and a center to the right and the left. You know, you learn in Chassidishe about Kava Tiferes, about the middle pole. And you say that in Klippa there's only 2 extremes and no pole. The question becomes, what is the significance of this middle pole? So they have Maamar Chassidishe a mashal, a very simple mashal in fact. A corner, a pina, a corner. How much space does a corner occupy? How much space does a corner? You have an eastern wall and you have a southern wall. How much is the corner between the east and the southern wall? Of course, the answer is 0. Half of the corner is east, half of the corner is south. There is no corner, but corners exist. And of course, the idea is a corner is an idea juxtaposed against a physical thing. The eastern wall and the southern wall are physical things. The corner where the eastern wall and the southern wall meet at a right angle is a miracle. It's a separate idea. So a corner has no reality other than what it takes from the 2 sides. But at the same time, it's a very unique reality. It creates peace and harmony between the 2 extremes. Or to use different illusion. Now, what's the difference between simple and beautiful? Beautiful is multicolored. Something has many colors is beautiful. Something has only one color, it's not so beautiful. But when you have one color and then you add another color, what makes it beautiful? You have 2 of the same, 2 colors. And of course the answer is Tiferes, that there's a unifying force. It doesn't simply bring the colors together, but from it emerges, through it converges beauty. And that's Tiferes. The beauty of bringing together different midas, and it's all about balance. As we know, the Tiferes, that the mid of Tiferes is the intermediate between the severe of kindness and the severe of severity, and joins them together. So in a perfect world, and you are a perfect person, it's all about balance, right, left, and center. Which explains why the Jewish people that are defined by balance and order, their existence is about this balance, and therefore accordingly we say the word holy about God Almighty 3 times. There's a fellow in 770 who comes in all the time, and when he says Kedusha, he reads it in English. And when he gets to Kaddish, 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 he says loud, holy, 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 the Lords of Lords of hosts, your glory fills up all the earth. And I must tell you, the first time I heard him say holy, 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 it disturbed me, it provoked me. You know why? Because you never pay attention like when you say it in English. We all say Kaddish, 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 yes, but when you say holy, 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 it somehow resonates differently. The argument that Rebbe here is putting forth is why 3 times, why not twice or 4 times? And we know the answer, because 3 represents the 2 poles on the balance. It's written about the Jewish people as well. The Jewish people be a segula, which of course means a precious treasure. So the Rabbi brings that the shadish of the word segula is the word segulta. Shasegel ogim on the kudas. The segel is 3 points. Smell a right and a left and a center, and so forth, which represents the balance of tikkun. So the Jewish people are called segel. They say kaddish because their holiday is balance. So in a perfect world, in a world where you're dealing with Kedusha alone, you want to maintain that balance. Continues the Rebbe, and I'm on line 62. Avo be'elam atei, in the world of Torah. There is no center. When you have no center, everything is disparate, everything is selfish, everything is for self. They don't join together because it's only 2 poles. Kindness is by itself. Severity is by itself. There's no exchanging ideas. Kindness is extremely kind, exactitude is extremely extreme, and there is no balance between them. Tikkun and Tiferes represent bringing balance into these extremes. So line 62, Aval. We just read in a few short lines the model of order and balance. Right, a left, and a center. That center is not only a middle, it's an integrator. Everything comes to the center. Continues the Rebbe in the world of polarity and extremes. The spheres are separate and sit one on top of the other. And there is no integration between the right and the left, between kindness, severity, exactitude, and softness, and so forth. And as a result, and it's only 2 poles. Chesed b'fnei atzmei, kindness by itself. Agavura b'fnei atzmei, and severity is by itself. And there are 2 issues here. First of all, there isn't that middle pole to soften each one by the opposite. And second of all, kindness is only kind, and severity is only severe, rather than kindness having the element of measure, and severity having the touch of compromise, because the middle doesn't only act as a center, it affects it in every detail. You have all the details, which is the mystical idea of hiskalos and integration, which means that not only all the parts get together in a unity, but within each part you have all the other parts, and that's the basis for the integration. But it's all rooted in the Tiferes, in that central pole that does not exist in a world of 2 as opposed to a world of 3. And the Rebbe continues on line 64, Chassidus explains this in many places. What does it say? And like I said, this is a standard Torah Tikkun discussion, which we had in the class, which is the first Maimed of this. Who the idea is, in the world of the light is many, much. And the vessels are small. And this doesn't only mean that there's a lot and a little, it means that the lights are polar or extreme. And the vessels are small, underdeveloped. And like it says in Chassidus, their real issue is they don't have the bittel, they don't have a sense of purpose. And because they don't have a sense of purpose, they act in their own interests, and therefore they're small. And when you have intense lights, extreme energies, and kelim that are small, when you consider the smallness of the vessels, in proportion to the light, it becomes impossible for those vessels to be a vessel for. To join together, chesed and gvura together. As we see, in fact, by people that an immature person A small person, when he's happy, everything is wonderful. When he's broken, everything is terrible. What he likes, he loves. What he hates, he cannot stand. There's no balance. Cannot bring together two opposites whatsoever. Ella. Instead, when he's inclined, when he's disposed towards kindness, he sees perfection. There's nothing bad here at all. Will have no leaning towards finding flaw. It's all good and kind. Line 68 now. However, on the other hand, when he leans towards severity, he won't suffer and tolerate at all, a leaning to the side of merit. In other words, this means that each person who's an extreme person is in one kav alone. On occasion, he's in the pole of kindness, l'schus. On occasion, he's in the left pole, l'chayv, for extreme and for judgment. And in such a condition, hakavim, for other than the poles are separated. Says the Rebbe on line 70, this is what happens when human emotions are divided into two as opposed to three poles. Kindness is only kind, severity is only severe, and there's no meeting of the minds, and which is why there's a shvira. Extremes are sometimes necessary, but as a way of life, they're simply unsustainable. And that's what this is. The division into two is extreme. Continues the Rebbe on line 72, Aval Betikun, in the world of order and balance. Teferes, beauty, acts as a conductor, as a compromiser, as a arbitrator between kindness and exactitude and severity. Hainu. This means that not only is there a center, but shagam b'shas hadin, a person can be in a mood, in a condition of judgment, and yuchali is gam k'natilas chus, he can find something nice to say. And the same is true to the other side. A person can be in the state of kindness and know that you can't give a child $100. Because Shabbatikun in the world of balance. The light is less, the vessels are many, in which many details. In other words, in each midah, you have all the other midas, which is the pnimius of the siskalalus. Nimtzan, as a consequence, how the vessels are broad. In other words, a bunch of little vessels in each vessel, which means each midah has all the midas within them, and therefore they share and they integrate and they overlap. Lekabel gam beis havchim, to suffer at the same time, to tolerate two poles. Okmei, for example, a person with a strong mind, yuchal lizbel, is able to suffer beis havchim yachad, two extremes at the same time. Vayishkenu b'meiche v'libe, they will rest in his brain, and on a rare occasion even in his heart. Shemitzadzeh yeshtvara l'chus, that at the same time they can see a reason for kindness. At the same time, there's a theory to chayv. Says the Heilige Rebbe, v'harei b'tikun, because in the world of tikkun, misyachtim chesed gvura yachtav, the kindness and the severity stop being poles; they join together. V'zehu inyan gimel kav, which is the concept of three. So three is not one more than two. Three means really making two one. Two is division. Three is that we have division and we create integration and unity between them. Now, tikkun is good. Order and balance is good. Tayu, polarity, is no good. Why? It's the source of evil, the source of klipa. Its source is high, but when it falls low. Yaakov is hoping that just as he's qualified himself for the ultimate meeting with Esau, Esau has spent the time, the interim time, qualifying himself to meet with Yaakov. But he discovers that that's not the case. Yaakov has corrected himself, and Esau has corrupted himself, and his polarity, his extremes are only intensified. So Yaakov realizes he cannot count on Esau helping him help Esau. He cannot count on Esau supporting him in his effort to elevate Esau. He has to do it by himself. And if he's going to do it, he has to draw Esau in. How? Mr. Balance is going to adopt extremes. And that's what the Maamar now says. Yaakov Avinu knows the risks of extremes. It's unnatural to him. He likes balance and order, humility. He's going to adopt extremes to show Esau that he can meet him in the realm of extremes. But of course, the extremes of Yaakov Avinu are good. What's an example of extremes? Mesiras Tshuva, giving tzedakah with the Mesiras Nefesh, overflowing uncontrollable joy. These are very holy things, and they're extreme. Now, normally, extreme expressions of Yiddishkeit are symptoms of an extreme world. Here, Yaakov seeks the extreme. He's looking for trouble. What the previous Rebbe said he doesn't want, Yaakov Avinu sought. The idea that a person lives in a normal world and he's looking for something to be crazy. He's trying to find an extreme. In this case, is because Yaakov Avinu understands if he is going to draw Tayu into Tikkun, he needs to reach Tayu on Tayu's terms. So Mr. Balance and Order, Mr. Tzaddik becomes Baal Tshuva, which is one way of explaining it. The difference between the Tzaddik and the Baal Tshuva, the Tzaddik is all about balance and wholeness. The Baal Tshuva is about extremes and extreme in energies. The Tzaddik, the Tomim, the balanced, Yaakov Avinu seeks these extremes in being able to access Esau. And we continue on line 77, says the holy Rebbe V'Omnam, however, Be'uv Dezu, the Yaakov Esau, in this episode of Yaakov and Esau, Yaakov is trying to draw to himself the polar energies of Tehu. Which is the light of Tehu, which is polar in its infinity. Lachein, or Lakach, accordingly, man l'sham. To get the polar energies of Esau to be incorporated into the balance of Yaakov Avinu, he had to meet Esau on Esau's terms, which means to be polar himself. Line 79, you do all of us know shaman, that when you want to arouse somebody else by offering of yourself to that person, tzarechli as it must be, that based on what you want that person to reciprocate, you need to give. If you want from somebody $1, you have to give the equivalent of $1. If you want somebody to give their heart, you have to give the equivalent of your heart. Yaakov wants Esau's extremes. He has to find extremes within himself. And psychologically, he didn't have it. Psychologically, he was normal. Psychologically, he was balanced. Psychologically, life was good. He found an extreme, and he used it to draw Esau in. Mishum, because Allah, based on how one reaches out to this that they wish to correct, that's how much effect you're going to have. And since this is the case, since in the world of Tehu things are poles, extremes, no center, Yaakov brings into his family, into his life, into his condition, poles. Yaakov needs to make of himself a similar model. Which is why the pasuk says on line 81 now, V'zehu, and this is why the Torah tells us, he divides himself into 2 camps, not into 3. Now, I don't know what the mysticism is, but it would stand to reason. Yaakov divided himself into 2 camps. One camp would be very sheepish, very neberdik, who knows how to pray to the Eibishter, and that's it. The other camp would be very intense and very combustible and ready for war. In other words, he takes away the balance that exists in his family to create 2 extremes. And he does this with intent. He wants each camp to be extreme in its way, that the sheepish Nebuch camp should be involved in prayer in an extreme way, and that the camp that's all about intensity and passion and aggressiveness should draw from the lack of balance and softness that the others would give them an extreme energy of milchama. And in both cases, these are 2 of the things that Yaakov attempted to do in accessing Esau. Tefillah and milchama, I'm just using them as examples, so that in him there would be an extreme, and the extremes within him would make Esau come to him. That in his camp, in his world, this should be the parallel of Elam Ateyu, Shalasham, where everything is by itself, no balance. And he hoped through this, Yiskasha, Elam Ateyu would attach himself to the world of extremes. That the extreme energies of the world of Teyu, which can be very high, but they can equally be very low, should be brought into Tikkun, should be brought into Kiddush. And like I said to you before, you know what this is like? This is like a person who never did an Aveda doing tshuva. How do you do that? Tshuva is a negative energy. It's an energy of running away from evil. But it's predicated on sin. And whenever we talk the upside of tshuva, what do we say? If you don't sin, you cannot do tshuva, but once you've sinned, the tshuva makes zdenis nas like izachias. The sin becomes a merit, which is the greatest thing of all. But if you've never sinned, where are you supposed to draw that energy from? And that's what Yaakov is trying to do, to draw into his balance an extreme of tshuva, because he needs it. He needs to do something risky. He needs to do the kind of thing the previous Rebbe says, I don't want it unless it's thrown on me, and yet Yaakov is seeking it out to lure, to draw, to bait Esau to come to him. Line 83, this explains another idea. And the Rebbe is going to have a long discussion now, really, a very long discussion, on karbonos, on sacrifice. We know what sacrifices are. Sacrifice is offering God animals, and of course the idea is that the animals represent the person. But when you offer God the sacrifice of an animal, there's many, many laws that involve, amongst other things, changing the animal. You shecht it, you slaughter it, you extract the blood and the fat, which is used for one purpose, the meat is used for a different purpose. Depending on the offering, some parts go on the mizbeach, some parts are eaten by the kohen, the majority of it is eaten by the bailim, and so forth. There's a lot of breaking down, because that's what you do in a world of order. Like you read about the Eskimos who would capture a whale, and they would use every single bit of it. They used it for decorations, they used it for their tents, they used it for their weapons, they used it for their meat. They didn't waste anything. It was broken down. That's lahavdil how karbonos are brought. It's all about using every aspect in an appropriate way. In this scheme, Yaakov's going to bring karbonos, but there's no breaking down. There's living animals sent as they are, living, into Esau's camp. There's no breaking down, there's no fine-tuning, there's no utilizing everything to its fullest. There is simply a sacrifice, because that's what the world of Tayu is. In the realm of karbonos, it's extreme karbonos. We can now explain Hatam, the nature of the reason he sent sacrifices, offerings of living animals, not slaughtered. And of course, physically, he was trying to bribe his brother because of his jealous nature, because of his gluttonous nature, because of his desire for material largesse, material wealth. But at the same time, there's also an appeal to the mystical Esau, to the extreme Esau, to react to the extreme offerings he was being given. The significance of this offering is and was Halo asman, a triggering, a stimulating, to draw the extreme of Esau to Yaakov Avinu. And the example for this is, as we know sacrifices in general, in the Beis HaMikdash. Shehem halo asman, you offer up an offering to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is going from the bottom up. Lahamshech mad, to draw light from the top down, as we all know. But in the case of Esau, he did the equivalent of a mincha, but they were very, very different. At the same time, his offerings were shalei yal derech eifin umishba, that did not conform to any of the methods and form and the tale of hakarbonos shebetera, as sacrifices are described in the Torah. And he explains, line 86 now. Because the fact was, shemais hakarbonos, when a carbon is brought in the Beis HaMikdash, first of all, there's all kinds of restrictions. Behemoths to hate him. Have to be kosher animals, not non-kosher animals. Ushchuten have to be shechted, dafke. It may be true that the shchita can be done by a non-kohen, but it must be shechted. We never find an offering of a living animal, with the one exception of azazel. In addition, when they sacrificed these animals that were kosher and shechted, as a rule, what went on the mizbeach was only the inedible parts, the blood and the fat, while the meat was eaten by the bailim and the kohen. As opposed to the offering described in our Parsha, this offering, which Jacob sent to Esau. They were animals that were unclean, treif, they were camels and so forth. Moreover, they were not shech, they were living. And they were not sacrificed, line 90. And the reason for all of this was, Mishom, because we're dealing here with an extreme situation that warrants extreme actions. Now I want you to think about this for a moment. You can use a cow to plow a field. If you use a cow to plow a field, and from that field you're going to produce wheat, which is going to be used in a carbon. So somehow that cow's energy is being made into Kedusha. You can use a donkey to pull the same plow, to plant the same wheat that will be used for the same carbon. So you could say that a cow and a donkey are equal in this element of birur, right? But they're not. Because you could shecht that cow, spill its blood, eat its meat after kashering it and elevate that meat. But if you did it to the donkey, that's treif, correct? So when it comes to eating, which is the deeper process of birur, you're breaking it down, splitting it up, transforming it, and making it into yourself, you can only eat kosher, not non-kosher. When it comes to using the energy of a living animal, where you're not really getting into the animal in what we would call in the culture a pnimius way. Nevertheless, you're taking something from that animal's energies that's considered a birur. It's a similar thing. Yaakov is using the energy of animals to lure Esau, but he's using the energies of these animals without taming them, without reducing them, without putting them into neat little piles, but just by using the thrust, the force of these animals as they are living, as they're not broken down. Because Yaakov is taking a page out of Esau's playbook. He's using extremes in Kedusha, like I described to you before, doing tshuva without having sinned, to draw Esau to himself. Lahamshich, I'll read from the beginning of line 90. Who the idea is the ascent upwards. Yaakov is offering to draw back down. In other words, the the polarity, the extreme of the world of Teo should be drawn into him. And the Rebbe says, when you want to access extremes from an extreme realm, the trigger, the stimulus, the spark that's going to bring it back are very different. Is altogether different. In the world of order and balance, when you want to trigger something to create a certain reciprocity, it's all very broken down. In the world of Tayu, you don't break it down at all. Shehu, because when you read about sacrifices in the Torah, that we know, the definition of Torah as a rule is it's about balance and order, Shabbat Tzilos. Line 93 just means in the world of balance, everything has an inner light, a revealed light. In other words, a limited light that fits into a vessel. That the vessels are reduced so that when it falls, they enter into the vessel in a departmentalized way. And then somehow there's an integration. In other words, first they're all separate little pots, and each one gets a little bit of light, and then they all share. And this creates the individuality and then the integration between all the individual aspects. In order for light to fit into those vessels, this indicates the light needs to be reduced and reduced. In order for the light to fit into the vessel. You know what it's like? Cellular health. There are two things about cellular health. A, each cell has to be separated from every other cell. And B, that the meetings and the interacting between the cells has to be healthy. So there are billions of cells. Everyone is very small, with a very specific definition, a certain amount of energy and life. But when they are healthy as individuals and they collaborate, they become an incredible force. We call it life, organism, or alive. In Taihu, you don't have that concept. Everything is in extremes. Everything is for itself. And therefore, when you're bringing an extreme carbon to the world that's associated with extremes, you don't break it down. You leave him exactly as he is. And we read on. In the Torah, which comes from Tikkun, everything is precise and broken down. Before the Torah, which was the Torah, describes that Allah lost the Tikkun in the world of order and in Kedusha. There's an order. Hakel b'digdukim, there's many nuances. Shumishpat ma'isakabanas, which is the laws of how a carbon is brought. And he repeats a second time now. Sheyihi yom behem is to hate enough to be kosher animals. Umegimel mina behem dafka, only 3 types of animals. V'shiyur shchutim dafka, they have to be shechted dafka. V'yesh harbe dvaram sha'carbon nifsel, there's so many things which render the carbon unfit. And then when the sacrifice is finally offered, it's so much particular, so many details determine how the carbon is brought. All of Torah and mitzvahs as we experience them today is defined by these measures. You have in Tanya, in one of the Igeres HaKedesh, I forgot at the moment which one it is, where he talks about the idea that Yiddishkeit is dafke tzimtzum, measured, limited. That's how the world of order works. The lights broke up into the details, and a limited teicha kelim to fit into the many different distinct vessels. And therefore the laws are that medaktikim gamkein, there's a lot of nuance and exactitude, become a minute to make it all fit. Line 102. Avol Yankiv. Yankiv represents order, tikkun, balance, normal more than anybody else. He's stepping out of his mold, and he's forcing himself to out Esau, to out extreme the extremist. Yaakov is trying to touch and to trigger the extreme world of Torah. It's a great infinite light, and it's not only great and infinite; it's also indivisible. There's no such thing as there being a vessel for Ein Sof. So when vessels meet Ein Sof, what happens? They hover, they circle each other. The light is touching the vessel in an indirect way. And accordingly, the carbon is af behemoths, tmeyas, unkosher animals, gemalim, nikes, v'chulu, camels, and so on. And they're living. And so on, to indicate the idea that in the polar realm of sacrifice, there's no breaking down, there's just polar offering. Key. Because since the light is Ein Sof, the idea of breaking down and being precise no longer exists. Infinity is infinite. And of course the upside of infinity is it forgives every crime. The downside of infinity is there's no accountability for any crime. Yachal can tolerate everything after maybe even unclean. They should be living. There's no rules, just extreme. That's what it is, extreme. And he brings a strange example. I think it's a strange example, but I'm not going to explain it because I don't know the explanation. This is the meaning of the Gemara, or the Medrash, that says that a chazir, that the idea of a pig, a swine becoming kosher, which of course we interpret to mean they're going to be transformed into a kosher animal. Says the Rebbe, no, it's going to remain not kosher. Also love in the future. Says there'll be no death in the world. There'll be a revelation of the Eibishter himself, and therefore the pig is going to be elevated, not by becoming kosher, but by rendering kosher not important. Which is not the case now. Line 109, Lachain, base in this entire rendition, we can now explain that Yainkiv Shesholach HaMincha Esau, the offering that Jacob said Esau his brother, Shualos, which is meant to be a trigger, Lemakif the Tayu, to the extreme energies of Tayu. The Bechina Saint Self, which are in Sof, Sholach Amkin Devarim Tmeim, he sends things which are spiritually unclean. For Lachain Sholach Amkin Gamal Menik, he sends camels. Because in this case, that's the correct offering. Just throw everything you have out at it. Now it says in Chassidus that the camels have a very high source. He took 10 camels. I'm not going to go into this. The bottom line is there's a mystical source of camels that is very high. And in the case of Yaakov Avinu, who was stepping out of his mold of Ma'av Tikkun, to be in the extreme mold of Esau, to draw Esau to him, this was the correct thing to do. Now don't get excited. We live in the age of hippies, of feel-gooders, of everybody's trying to find a new way to justify being liberal in our Yiddishkeit in the name of saving souls. So here's Treif, it's a way to fix people, yeah? It says, the Rebbe v'kolza lo yochel asas rak Yaakov. It was true for Yaakov then, before the Torah was given. At that point, there was an option of exercising extreme energies to try and harness an extreme. Aval anachnu, as opposed to us. Kvar nitan lanu atayra. The Torah is already ours. In other words, we're bound by its constraints. Mebechinas atikon, where everything is balanced. Accordingly, if it's unclean and it's prohibited according to the Torah, you're not allowed to partake. It wouldn't even be effective to be extreme. You're going to fail. So this is not possible. It's not advised. Yaakov could step out of his model into this extreme model, and it would be kedusha. If we did the same, it would not be kedusha. It would fail. But at least we learn from the story this idea that, to summarize, Yaakov discovers that Esau is not where he is. So Yaakov has to draw Esau to him, and he draws Esau to him by imitating Esau's technique and Esau's methods. And Mr. Hashem, next week we'll finish with help of God, of course.